Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson. One of them was an orphan, pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and went on to become president. The other one had a cameo in Home Alone 2. Must be historically fantastic. Hi folks, welcome to Historically Fantastic, where we take history's complex questions and come up with some straightforward answers. I'm your host, Michael Jacobs. In today's episode, we're going to be comparing and contrasting Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. Today's big question, is it fair to Andrew Jackson that Donald Trump keeps comparing himself to Andrew Jackson? This question comes from the fact that, especially early in Donald Trump's presidency, a lot of people compared his ascension to the White House to Andrew Jackson. Both externally and the White House themselves. I mean, look at this photo from the Oval Office. There's actually a couple of these with a portrait of Andrew Jackson looming over Donald Trump, looking over his shoulder as the mentor to the mentee, although I doubt that Donald Trump would ever assume that anyone was his mentor. So today's episode is twofold. One, how similar and how different are these two guys? Two, is it fair to Andrew Jackson that Donald Trump keeps saying that he's like Andrew Jackson? What we're going to do is we're going to dive into 5 different categories, comparing and contrasting these two men. We're going to look at their background, their personal lives, their campaign, their political background, and then finally their actual presidency. And whichever has more similarities or differences, that's what we're going to decide on. Now, quick caveat about history. History is not so black and white. We can't say they are different or they are similar. It's on a spectrum. They're more similar. They're somewhat similar. They're more different. We're going to be talking about this in those terms. Let's start with background. Andrew Jackson was born somewhere in the Carolinas. We're not actually quite sure if it was North or South Carolina, to an impoverished family. In fact, his father didn't even see his own son be born. He died right before Andrew Jackson was born. Andrew Jackson's mother, who he loved, which is important for another category, died when he was 13 years old. So early on, he was an orphan that had to fend for himself, and he certainly did so. He made his money in the plantation business and was a self-made man. Caveat, most of his wealth was on the back of slavery, so that is an asterisk on this idea of a self-made man. He also had a very strong military background before he became president. He had a small role in the Revolutionary War. He fought against Native Americans in the Creek Wars and Seminole Wars, and he became a household name at the Battle of New Orleans towards the end of the War of 1812. Here's the fun fact of the episode. The most famous battle of the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans, was actually fought after the war was officially over. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814, and the Battle of New Orleans took place in January of 1815, a few weeks after the war was officially over. It took so long for news to get from Washington, D.C. all the way down to New Orleans that they didn't know. And Andrew Jackson became famous in a battle fighting against an enemy that there was already a treaty. Plus, the Battle of New Orleans gives us a great song. In 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. Let's move on to Donald Trump's background. Donald Trump was born to a wealthy Scottish-American family in New York City. His parents had a lot of money, and they actually shipped him off to boarding school when he was quite young. After he graduated from Wharton School at Penn, one of the most elite MBA programs in the nation, he got $1 million loan from his parents to start his own industry, and he eventually bought out his parents. So, not really pulling himself up by the bootstrap there. As far as military history, he deferred 5 draft notices for the Vietnam War, 4 of which were for his education, and 1 was for a medical thing going on with his foot. So, no military history whatsoever. For background, I'm going to say vastly different. Trump is from a New York elite family. Jackson was from the middle of nowhere Carolinas and an orphan who pulled himself out of nothing to become president. Let's move on. Next category, we're going to go to personal life. How are Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson different? And for this category, I'm going to stick strictly with women and their personal relationships with women. Let's start with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had 2 loves of his life. His mother, who died when he was 13, and Rachel. Rachel Jackson is one of the most interesting, almost first ladies in American history. First off, their relationship got off onto a very scandalous start because Rachel was still married when Andrew Jackson and Rachel got married. She was married to a man in the military service, and they were separated, and their divorce was not final when they first tied the knot. They actually had to have a second wedding in order to make it official. Now today, that might not seem so scandalous, but you can imagine in the 18 teens, 1820s, this was everywhere. In fact, his political enemies used it as a weapon against Jackson. Tragically, 3 weeks before Jackson is elected president, Rachel actually dies from the stress that this scandal played on her and her husband. And Jackson also defended women's honor. One of his cabinet members' wife, Peggy Eaton, was formerly a prostitute. And when this came out to the wives of other politicians in Washington, D.C., they often excluded her from different social scenes and different social circles. Jackson didn't take too kindly to this because, like himself, who came from nothing and had to work to get into this and infiltrate the East Coast Washington, D.C. political scene, he wanted to defend her. And he actually lost a lot of political clout getting rid of many cabinet members because they refused to apologize to Peggy Eaton. That's pretty amazing that Jackson was willing to give up political power in order to defend a woman's honor. I forgot to mention that Andrew Jackson also killed a man in a duel because that man scrutinized the fact that Rachel was previously married. He killed a guy to defend the honor of his wife. Wow. Let's move on to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has had 3 wives, Ivana, Marla, and Melania. His first wife, Ivana, he met at a nightclub. He famously said that marrying him would be the best deal she ever makes. And very publicly, he had an affair with Marla while married to Ivana. Later on, Marla and Trump would get divorced and he would marry First Lady Melania Trump. And as far as the differences between Trump and Jackson, besides number of wives, I think the perspective that each man has about women is quite different. Donald Trump famously has said some pretty nasty things about women, specifically to Billy Bush. If you haven't seen that quote, I'm not going to say it here. You should probably look it up, but be warned, it's very graphic. He also has been accused of having relationships with adult film stars while still married. So their personal lives seem to be quite different. In fact, historian H.W. Brands had this to say about Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. Had Jackson heard Trump's boast to Billy Bush, Jackson would have run him out of town, possibly after a thorough caning. That's pretty different. So check number 2 under mostly different. Let's move on to category 3, their campaign. How did they run for the presidency? Andrew Jackson ran for presidency in 1824, 1828, and 1832. 3 different times. 1824 is a very interesting presidential election here in America. It's known as the corrupt bargain. If you don't know anything about the election of 1824, I highly recommend that you Google it. He didn't get the presidency despite winning the majority of the popular vote. 1828, however, Jackson is going to run away with it. And what we see during this time period is a huge spike in voter turnout. The reason? We have for the first time universal white male suffrage. People in America, white men, no longer had to own land in order to vote. So we see this huge surge in the number of voters. Couple that with Jackson's strategy. And his strategy is appealing to the common man. This idea of populism, appealing to the masses. Jackson, the 7th president, was the first president America had who wasn't an East Coast elitist. All the men before him were schooled and proper and ran in the same circles. Jackson was an outsider, and he kicked in the door of Washington, D.C. and wanted to change things, and he campaigned as such. He famously said he was going to turn the rascals out of Washington, D.C. That sounds familiar, that kind of talk, right? He wanted to give working class white Americans land to cultivate and have them be independent of the federal government. Donald Trump is also going to appeal to the common man. The election of 2016, he would play to the fact that people were disillusioned with Washington, D.C. The fact that middle class, blue collar workers did not have their interests met by the political system in Washington, D.C. What's the famous line of Donald Trump? He was going to drain the swamp, turn the rascals out, drain the swamp. That's very similar talk. A lot of people called Trump a populist president because he often talked about bringing jobs back and factory workers. I think there's a lot of similarities here. They're both populist presidents. A different brand of populism. Jackson was more of actual populism. Trump's brand has been classified as penthouse populism, meaning that he appeared to be populist, but really, again, he's actually an East Coast elitist. But I'm still going to say they're similar. Political experience. Andrew Jackson had a lot of political experience going into the White House. He had served as a congressman for the state of Tennessee. He had served on the Tennessee Supreme Court. He actually helped write the Tennessee Constitution. He had a lot of political experience, and he knew how to act like a politician. Despite the fact he was going to turn the rascals out, he still knew how to play the game, which you kind of have to play to be successful in the White House. Donald Trump, however, has never held political office. His first elected position was in 2016 when he became president. Obviously, that's different, right? Jackson and Trump had very different political experience. Looks like differences already win 3-1. On to category 5, the actual presidency. This one's kind of hard to judge because we're not done with Trump yet. The book isn't closed. We're only about a year and a half in at the time of this video being made. We do have the luxury, though, of Jackson's presidency being gone for 160 years. We can analyze it. We see the long-term effects of his presidency and his legacy on presidents today, obviously. Say what you will about Jackson, he cared about the Union. Jackson also was willing to play the political game. Even though he wanted to turn the rascals out, he still knew that there were games to be played in DC. If you want to get stuff done, you have to play politics. And he knew how to play politics. He had the experience. Trump doesn't have that. And so far, there seems to be some instances where he seems lost politically. So Trump's presidency so far, he's fulfilling promises regarding immigrants, clearly cracking down on illegal immigrants with recent immigration policy. They seem to target minorities a lot. Also, Jackson targeted minorities with his Indian Removal Act. So there are definitely similarities so far in their presidency, but I think Jackson playing the political game better than Trump is making them a little more different. So in conclusion, as far as are they more similar, are they more different? They're definitely more different. Let's go on to the actual question of this episode. Is it fair to Jackson that Trump compares himself to Jackson? I say no. If Jackson was alive today, I don't think he'd appreciate being compared to Trump. Jackson was a very serious man, and not that Trump's not, but I think he would view Donald Trump as being an unserious politician and not fit for the presidency strictly because he doesn't know how to act presidential. Again, I think that's from Jackson's point of view. Also, Jackson can't defend himself. Jackson has no say in the matter. He's been gone for 160 years. Does that mean that we can't compare ourselves to people who are no longer around? No. But I think if we do, we have to think about whether or not there are actually comparisons to be made. And sure, Donald Trump and him were similar in their campaign promises and being populist presidents, but so far, it seems like one was more of an actual populist president than the other. Thanks for watching. Hey folks, thanks for watching Historically Fantastic. Believe it or not, this is my first episode ever. Thank you so much. Please hit that subscribe button right down there. Comment below. What do you think? New episodes coming out for the next couple weeks. We're going to be talking about Helen Keller being a socialist. We're going to talk about this crazy domestic terrorist, John Brown. We're going to be talking about John F. Kennedy's sexual exploits. We're going to be talking about the justification of dropping the bomb. So check out those episodes, subscribe so you don't miss out on anything. Guys, thanks for watching.